So how's it going, guys? Today we have a quick video on how to read P&IDs, given a kind of a summary, brief overview with some tips and tricks that will hopefully help you as you begin reading P&IDs and gain more knowledge as you go along the way. So starting off, a P&ID stands for Piping and Instrumentation Diagram, and just in itself, that's a pretty good description of what's going on in a couple words. So it's showing your piping within a process and a lot of the instruments that are also in the process. So this is very common in many industries, and it's actually an industry standard. So if you can read a P&ID at one location or a company, this often translates pretty well with some slight variations in your process and maybe some of the symbols. But all in all, usually it's pretty standard throughout the industry. And the P&ID itself, we talked about piping and instruments. It talks about your valves, some machinery. Um, Piping size, some material, kind of how all the pipes are connected and which way they're flowing, and then also has some information on control within the process. Okay, guys, so kind of jumping into it, this is a key showing some of the symbols that you'll commonly find on P&IDs. So starting off, it'll probably be hard to know a lot of these, but as you keep reading them, you'll learn to memorize these. So some pretty common ones, you have gate valves in the top left. Down at the bottom, your pressure relief valves are pretty common. Things like that. So one major point of advice I have is usually at the beginning of your either your printed out P&ID book or more commonly probably files on your computer. Towards the beginning, usually there's some kind of key that is similar to this, but a little more extensive with all your different symbols that might be even more specific to your company. So it's good to find this and reference it as you go about reading the P&IDs. And often you can find some symbols online too, since it's kind of standard through the industry as well if questions come up. Okay, now we're getting a little more specific on some of the symbols for instrumentation. So usually your instruments are going to be abbreviated with a 2 to 3 letter code, as long as with a number code at the bottom. So the first letter in this code is going to be your element of interest. So here on the right is kind of an example. You see it's Fi. So our first element would be flow, and then some other elements that are pretty common, temperature level, and there's many more. And then for the second one, you can see this one's an indicator, but it could also be a transmitter controller. So that lets us know that this instrument is a flow indicator. And I was talking about the separate page usually at the beginning of your P&ID files with the symbol key. Often there's a kind of list that tells you what each of the letters mean and in their specific position. So as you can see at the beginning, T stands for temperature, but in the other positions it would stand for transmitter. So usually there'll be a key for that you can reference if you don't know anything about a certain abbreviation. And moving on to the number code, usually it's a two sets of numbers with a dash in the middle. So usually the left side is the unit or area. So this will be specific to your plant, how everything is numbered. So it could be 24 as your utilities or furnaces or something like that. And then the next set is the instrument specific number. So in that area, usually you'll have numbering on each instrument, 1 to however many there are. And this kind of gives you a code to talk about or maybe find more information about it. So you can see that this is flow indicator 2401. Also, there's codes that are not following this formula. They're kind of just abbreviations throughout the P&IDs. These wouldn't be on instruments per se, but just within the P&ID. So example is BFW, boiler feed water, and ATM to atmosphere. So usually this can also be found on that pages with the key. Okay, now getting into the symbols for some lines and pipes throughout the P&ID. So just looking at the P&ID, a lot of the space is going to be taken up by these different pipe flows throughout it. So usually a solid line is going to be your process flow line. This can change whatever's in the material. You know, it could be whatever gas your plant's producing, it could be water, just a lot of different things within the process. But this is kind of just your normal pipe that you would think about. You also have pneumatic signals, which would be a skinnier line with two dashes through it. And this would be your such pneumatic lines, such as your compressed air heading to control valves or whatever else is controlling. And then also you have electrical signals. So this would be more connecting your transmitters to controllers and things like that. So that would be a dashed line, and those are pretty standard throughout different P&IDs. And then you also have some kind of a code on a lot of the process flow lines, and this kind of tells you information about the pipe. I've seen it change the specifics from companies, but here's kind of an example. Is usually the first is your size, so this would be a 2-inch pipe. You have your whatever fluid is in there, just kind of giving you a heads up on what you're working with, and then kind of some more specific numbers. And this would usually be somewhere within your company. You'd have a kind of a pipe codes that would tell you, hey, it's made out of this material and it's this kind of piping. Okay, so similarly to how we talked about the different symbols for valves and instruments, there's also equipment listed within your P&ID, and there will be different symbols for the different kinds of equipment. Usually these kind of look like what you think they would look like, your drums, tanks, pumps. And each one of these are going to have their own equipment number, usually listed next to it, and sometimes some information, uh, maybe what pressure they're at, things like that, next to it as well. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all on this one. Okay, so now kind of putting it all together, here is a diagram that's kind of similar to what a P&ID would look like. It's missing a lot of the codes, like the pipe codes we talked about, and equipment numbers, but for the purpose of the video, it should be fine. So as you can see, the solid lines are kind of showing the flow throughout the diagram, connecting our different instruments and different pieces of equipment together. Usually, sometimes you see these arrows, they're either coming from off the page or directed off the page. So these usually have a kind of a tidbit that tells you what P&ID it's coming from or going to. This allows you to trace lines through further through the process, because usually you can only fit a couple pieces of equipment on one P&ID. So if you need to trace something further, you can kind of follow it to the next P&ID and so forth. So kind of ways to go about looking and reading them is kind of following the method I talked about if you're looking at a specific line, or kind of just looking for the piece of equipment you're looking at. So maybe the tray column, and then kind of looking at all the inputs and outputs around the tray column or whatever piece of equipment. Some other things to note on actual P&IDs down in the bottom left, there's usually a section for revisions and the different MOCs and projects that made the revisions. So this can be a good reference if maybe you think there's an error or you notice something changed. You can kind of look at the revisions and then maybe find an old P&ID to see how the system used to be set up. And then also, you kind of see some flow rates throughout here, like heading into the right side of that tray column, it says 605 GPM. So those can be accurate, but it's one of those things where you want to go and find some kind of instrument or DCS number that would tell you what the actual flow is at the time, because I have seen these be very wrong. If something else in the process changes, you don't want to put in a missized valve or piece of equipment just because you didn't do due diligence in confirming this number. Okay, so some brief last additional notes. P&IDs should not be 100% relied on for a project. So although we try to keep our P&IDs up to date as much as possible, there's always the possibility of discrepancies between that and what's in the field. So you always want to go onto the field and review the different pieces of equipment out there with your own eyes and the different connections before you make any major changes or move forward too in-depthly with any projects. If you find any discrepancies, you should do your best to correct them, make the changes on the P&ID, and send them to the drawer. Kind of going along with changes, some color coding that's common on P&IDs is red lines to add, green lines to demo, and then uh, blue notes are for the drawer. So these are things that won't actually be on the P&ID, but maybe you want to get a message of across whatever that was. And then I already talked about the revisions, so yeah, that was kind of just a brief overview. Hopefully, um, it's helpful and you guys can kind of build off this knowledge in your future careers. So take care.